The breaking point came in February during one of those brutal Texas ice storms that turned the world into a crystalline prison and cut power lines like they're made of paper. The electricity had been out for 2 days, leaving us huddled around the fireplace for warmth while the wind howled outside like the voices of the damned. It was during this storm that Mama collapsed while bringing in firewood, her face gray with pain, and one hand pressed to her chest in a gesture I would come to associate with her failing heart. The sight of her crumpling in the snow, so small and fragile, against the white vastness of our frozen yard, sent me into a panic that had nothing to do with my own safety, and everything to do with the terrible realization that she might leave me alone with him permanently. It took 20 minutes to get through to the hospital in the county seat on our old rotary phone, the lines crackling with static and the constant threat of disconnection. Another hour passed before the ambulance could navigate the ice-slicked roads to reach us, the paramedics sliding and cursing as they loaded Mama onto a stretcher, while I watched from the porch, my breath making clouds in the freezing air. Exhaustion. The doctor said later, his voice grave with the weight of delivering bad news to a family already stretched too thin. Her body's been running on empty for too long. We're talking about weeks, maybe months of recovery time. She needs rest, real rest, not just a night's sleep between double shifts. Mama spent a week in the hospital, and during that week I lived alone in the house with my father, in an isolation so complete it felt like being buried alive. No school because of the storm, no neighbors checking in because the roads were impassable, no escape from his constant suffocating presence that seemed to fill every room like toxic gas. He was careful at first, almost gentle, as if Mama's absence had reminded him that I was still just a child who needed some semblance of normal parental care. He cooked meals badly, but with apparent effort, and made sure the fire stayed lit, and even asked about my homework, as if he cared about my education, rather than using it as another way to control me. But by the 3rd day, the mask began to slip. By the 4th, it had fallen away, entirely revealing the monster underneath in all his terrible glory. "Your Mama's weak," he said over breakfast on the 5th morning, his eyes cold and calculating as he studied me across the kitchen table, like a chess player planning his next move. "Always has been, really. Can't handle the responsibilities of being a wife and mother. Her heart's giving out because she's not strong enough for this life, not tough enough to do what needs to be done." I kept my eyes on my oatmeal, afraid to look at him directly, afraid of what I might see in his face when he spoke about Mama with such casual cruelty. "Mama works hard. She's just tired from taking care of everyone else all the time. She's broken." He corrected, his voice hardening with the absolute certainty of someone who'd found a convenient truth to justify his actions. "Broken women can't hold a family together, can't meet a man's needs, can't provide what a household requires to function properly. But a strong daughter? She can fill that role. She can be everything a man needs if she's willing to step up and accept her responsibilities." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and making my vision blur at the edges with terror so pure it was almost paralyzing. He wasn't just talking about the assaults anymore. He was talking about replacing Mama entirely, making me his wife in everything, but name transforming me into a replacement for the woman whose heart was failing, under the strain of loving a monster. That night, when he came to my room with purpose rather than urgency, there was a difference in his demeanor that chilled me to the bone. Less desperation, more possession. He moved like a man claiming property, like someone who no longer had to worry about being caught or questioned or held accountable for his actions. "When your Mama comes home," he said afterward, straightening his clothes with the casual precision that had become sickeningly familiar. "Things are going to change around here. She's going to be weak for a while, too sick to handle her wifely duties, and you're going to have to step up. Be the woman of the house in every way that matters." I lay there in the darkness, after he left my body aching and my mind reeling with the full scope of what he was planning. This wasn't just about sexual gratification, it was about complete control, total possession, the transformation of his daughter into a replacement wife who couldn't leave or complain or refuse his demands because she had nowhere else to go. In that moment, staring at the ceiling while snow continued to fall outside my window, I finally understood that this wasn't going to end on its own. It was going to get worse, much worse, until either I found the courage to fight back or I disappeared entirely into whatever broken thing he wanted me to become. The choice, I realized, was mine, and for the first time since that terrible night in Grandpa's bed, I began to believe that I might be strong enough to choose fight over surrender. When Mama came home from the hospital, she was indeed different, frailer, more tentative, like a bird with a broken wing learning to fly again. The doctor had prescribed rest and medication for her heart condition, but rest was a luxury we couldn't afford on a struggling farm where bills waited for no one's recovery and chores demanded attention regardless of human frailty. I watched her struggle through simple tasks that had once been second nature, hanging laundry on the line, with hands that shook from exhaustion, cooking dinner for 3 people, when she could barely stand for more than a few minutes at a time, cleaning a house that seemed determined to generate endless dust and disorder, no matter how much effort we put into maintaining it. Through it all, my father watched too, his eyes calculating every moment of weakness, every sign of vulnerability, every opportunity that her condition might provide for his own twisted purposes. I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he planned how to use her illness to his advantage, how to leverage her dependence on him into greater control over both of us. "Clara needs to take things easy," he announced at dinner one evening, his voice carrying the authority of a man, making a decree that wouldn't be questioned by anyone foolish enough to challenge his wisdom. "Doctor's orders, after all. Emma's old enough to handle more responsibility around here. It's time she learned what it means to be a woman to contribute to this family in ways that actually matter." The words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the February cold seeping through our windows, like fingers of ice searching for victims. Mama just nodded wearily, too exhausted to read the subtext in his pronouncement, too trusting to understand that her husband was already planning to use their daughter as her replacement in ways that violated every law of nature and decency. "Emma's always been such a help," she said, her voice carrying the thin quality of someone speaking through constant fatigue. "I don't know what I'd do without her, especially now when everything seems so difficult." What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, because I was too afraid and too ashamed to tell her, was that helping had taken on an entirely new meaning in my father's twisted vocabulary. When she retired early to bed, which happened most nights now, he expected me to fill every role she'd once occupied. Cook his meals exactly the way he liked them. Clean his clothes and iron his shirts for church with the precision of a professional laundress. Listen to his complaints about the farm, the weather, the unfairness of a world that didn't appreciate his sacrifices, and satisfy his other needs in ways that made my skin crawl and my soul shrivel a little more each time. But something fundamental had changed in me during those isolated days while Mama was in the hospital. Maybe it was the stark clarity of my father's intentions laid out in words too clear to misinterpret or explain away. Maybe it was the realization that her illness made her an even less reliable potential protector than before. Or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the breaking point that every abuse victim eventually finds the moment when the fear of fighting back becomes less powerful than the fear of continuing to endure. Whatever it was, I began to fight back in small ways, testing the boundaries of his control, like a prisoner exploring the walls of her cell for weaknesses that might be exploited. I started with questions, simple and direct challenges to the narrative he'd constructed around our relationship. When he cornered me in the barn the next week, his hands already reaching for me with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance, I didn't just lie there and endure it like a piece of furniture being used for its intended purpose. "Why do you do this?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the tears on my cheeks and the terror clawing at my throat like a living thing. What kind of father hurts his own daughter this way? He paused in his assault, surprised by my directness. For months, I'd been silent during these encounters, dissociating so completely that I might as well have been a doll for all the response I gave to his violations. This new Emma, this girl who asked questions and demanded answers, clearly caught him off guard in a way that made him fumble for the familiar justifications. "I'm not hurting you, Emma," he said, his voice taking on that preacher's tone he used when explaining complex theological concepts to his congregation. "I'm teaching you about love, about what women are for in God's grand design, about the sacred bond between fathers and daughters that goes deeper than what most people understand." This isn't love," I said, flatly, meeting his eyes with a directness that made him blink and pull back slightly. "This is what evil looks like when it wears a daddy's face and quotes scripture to justify itself." His hand cracked across my cheek, the slap echoing in the confined space of the barn like a gunshot that seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long time. "Don't you dare judge me, you little slut!" He snarled, his mask of paternal concern slipping to reveal the monster beneath in all its ugly glory. "I provide for this family. I keep a roof over your head and food on the table and clothes on your back. The least you can do is show some gratitude, show some understanding of what a man sacrifices for his family every single day." But even as he continued the assault with increased violence, using his anger as fuel for greater brutality, I could see that my words had shaken him. The righteous certainty he wrapped around himself like armor had cracked just a little, and through that crack, I caught a glimpse of something that might have been doubt or fear, or the terrible knowledge that what he was doing was as wrong as I claimed it was. I started keeping track of his reactions with the methodical attention to detail of a scientist studying a dangerous specimen, learning which words and questions cut deepest into his carefully constructed self-image. Slowly, carefully, I began building a case, not just in my notebook, but in my own mind, understanding his weaknesses, his fears, his desperate need to be seen as righteous and justified in all his actions. It was dangerous work, like poking a wounded animal with a stick while hoping it wouldn't turn and savage you completely. But it was also necessary work because I was beginning to understand that if I was ever going to be free, I would have to be the one to free myself. No knight in shining armor was coming to rescue me. No deus ex machina was going to solve my problems for me. If I wanted salvation, I would have to earn it through my own courage and cunning. The confrontation that would change everything began to build in the spring as the ice melted and the world began to thaw, and Mrs. Harlan's concern for my welfare grew too strong to ignore any longer. It started with an assignment she gave our English class in March, a personal essay about overcoming challenges. Most of my classmates wrote about losing a pet or moving to a new school or dealing with divorced parents. I wrote about monsters that wear familiar faces and the difficulty of speaking truth when no one wants to hear it. I didn't name names or provide specific details that would have made the essay an obvious cry for help. Instead, I wrote in metaphors and allegories, creating a story about a girl trapped in a castle with a dragon that everyone else thought was a benevolent king. The dragon fed on the girl's fear and silence, growing stronger with each day that passed, without anyone recognizing its true nature. When Mrs. Harlan handed back our graded papers the following week, she asked me to stay after school. My essay had received an A+, but written in red ink beneath the grade were the words, "Please see me." "Emma?" she said after the other students had left, settling into the chair beside my desk rather than maintaining the formal distance of teacher and student. "This essay? It's beautifully written, but it concerns me deeply. Are you trying to tell me something specific about your home situation?" My heart began to race, thip, 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 like a hummingbird's wings, as I realized that my attempt at subtle communication had been more transparent than I'd intended. It's just a story, Mrs. Harlan, fiction. You said we could write about anything that challenged us, and I thought it would be interesting to explore metaphorical challenges. She studied my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades learning to read between the lines of what children said versus what they meant. Emma, honey, I've been teaching for 30 years. I know the difference between creative fiction and a cry for help. And this? She held up my essay pages that suddenly felt like evidence in a case I wasn't ready to prosecute. This feels like truth dressed up in prettier clothes. I wanted to tell her everything. The words crowded in my throat like prisoners fighting to escape, but they were held back by the stronger force of terror of what would happen if my father discovered I'd spoken, terror of not being believed, terror of making everything worse instead of better. I'm fine. I whispered the lie slipping off my tongue with practiced ease, even as everything inside me screamed that I was the opposite of fine. Mrs. Harlan was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options, calculating the risks of pushing too hard versus the risks of not pushing hard enough. Finally, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small card with a phone number written on it in her careful handwriting. This is the number for the County Social Services Office, she said, pressing the card into my hand with gentle firmness. If you ever need help, real help, you can call this number and they'll send someone to talk to you. Someone whose job it is to keep children safe when their families can't or won't do it. I stared at the card, its white surface seeming to glow with possibility and danger in equal measure. What if someone called them, but it turned out to be a mistake? What if there wasn't really a problem and they came anyway? Then they'd determine that through their investigation and close the case, she said simply. But Emma-trained professionals are very good at recognizing the difference between false alarms and real danger. They don't take children away from loving homes because of misunderstandings. That night, I hid the card in my journal, nestled between pages of documented abuse, like a seed of hope waiting for the right conditions to sprout. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. The fear was still too strong, the risk too great, the potential consequences too terrible to contemplate. The explosion that would finally force action came 3 weeks later, on a night when spring storms rolled across Texas with the violence of God's own judgment. I was in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner when I heard his footsteps approaching with the heavy, deliberate rhythm that meant he'd been drinking and had decided it was time for another lesson. Mama had gone to bed early with one of her headaches, leaving us alone in the house with only the sound of thunder and the television droning in the background. Time for your education to continue, he said, his voice slurred, but determined, his eyes holding the glassy shine that alcohol brought to them like a false light that revealed nothing but darkness underneath. But this time, when he reached for me, something inside me finally snapped. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of violation, or maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Harlan's card hidden in my journal, or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the point where death seemed preferable to continued submission. Instead of freezing or trying to pull away, I grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove and swung it at his head with all the strength my 15-year-old body could muster. The impact was tremendous, a sound like a watermelon hitting concrete that seemed to echo through the kitchen and down the hallway and into every corner of our old farmhouse. He staggered backward, blood streaming from a gash on his temple, his eyes wide with shock that his compliant victim had dared to fight back. "You little bitch!" he roared, lunging toward me with murder in his eyes and hands that reached for my throat like claws seeking prey. "I'll teach you what happens to daughters who forget their place." But the skillet had given me courage along with the weapon, and this time I was ready for him. I swung again, catching him in the shoulder and sending him crashing into the kitchen table with a force that shook the entire house and sent dishes flying to shatter on the linoleum floor. The noise was tremendous, breaking glass, splintering wood, two bodies locked in desperate combat, and underneath it, all the sound of my voice screaming with rage and terror and the primal fury of a creature fighting for its life. "Get away from me!" I shrieked, brandishing the skillet like a medieval weapon while he tried to regain his footing. "Don't touch me ever again, I'll kill you if you touch me." It was then that Mama appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion from whatever uneasy sleep her medication had granted her. She stood there in her nightgown and robe, her face pale with confusion and growing horror as she took in the scene before her. Her husband bleeding and enraged, her daughter armed and defiant, the kitchen in ruins around them like a battlefield. "What in God's name is happening here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm raging outside our windows. My father tried to compose himself, tried to shift back into the role of the reasonable parent dealing with an out-of-control child. "Clara Emma's had some kind of breakdown. She attacked me for no reason. I think we need to get her some help." "No," I screamed, cutting him off before he could spin another web of lies to trap us both. "Tell her the truth. Tell her what you've been doing to me since Grandpa died." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Mama looked back and forth between us, her face cycling through confusion, dawning understanding, and finally a horror so complete it seemed to age her 10 years in as many seconds. "Emma," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of knowledge she didn't want to accept. "Baby, what are you talking about?" "Ah, he's been raping me." I said the words coming out clear and strong, despite the way my whole body was shaking with adrenaline and terror, and the aftermath of violence. "Since the night Grandpa died, he comes to my room and he forces himself on me, and he tells me it's what families do. He tells me it's love, but it's not love, it's torture." Mama's face went white as fresh snow, and I saw her hand go to her chest. In that gesture I'd learned meant her heart was struggling to keep up with the demands being placed on it. "Silas," she whispered, turning to look at her husband with eyes that held the terrible clarity of someone seeing clearly for the first time. "Tell me she's lying. Tell me this isn't true." He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another story about troubled daughters and misunderstandings, and the difficulty of raising children in a fallen world. But something in her expression, the absolute certainty that she would know if he lied, that their marriage and their family hung in the balance of his next words, made him pause. And in that pause, the truth written on his face was as clear as words carved in stone. "Clara," he said finally, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone who knew they were losing a battle they couldn't afford to lose. "You don't understand the pressures I've been under, the stress of the farm, of your illness, of trying to hold this family together when everything seems to be falling apart. A man has needs, and when his wife can't..." She slapped him, then her small hand cracking across his bloody face, with surprising force, the sound sharp and final in the devastated kitchen. "Get out," she said quietly. "Clara, listen to me. Get out of this house. Get out now before I call the sheriff and tell him what you've done to our daughter." For a moment, I thought he might fight, might use his superior strength to overpower both of us and silence the truth forever. His hands clenched into fists. His face darkened with rage, and he took a step toward us that made every muscle in my body tense for renewed violence. But something in Mama's expression, the absolute certainty that she would follow through on her threat, that the woman who'd been afraid to stand up to him for 20 years had finally found a line she wouldn't let him cross, stopped him cold. "This is my house," he said, but the words lacked conviction, sounding more like a question than a statement of fact. "Not anymore, it isn't," Mama replied, moving to stand beside me with her arm around my shoulders in a gesture of protection that I'd been waiting for my entire life. "Pack a bag and get out. If you're still here in the morning, I'm calling the police. And if you ever come near my daughter again, I'll kill you myself." He stared at us for a long moment. His wife and daughter united against him for the first time in our family's history. And I could see the exact moment when he realized that his reign of terror was finally over, that the kingdom he'd built on fear and silence was crumbling around him like a house of cards in a windstorm. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his bedroom, his footsteps heavy with defeat. 20 minutes later, I heard his truck roar to life in the driveway, the sound fading into the distance as he drove away into the storm and out of our lives forever. By morning, he was gone. But as I would soon learn, removing him from our house was only the first step in a much longer journey toward justice and healing. The days that followed his departure passed in a strange kind of suspended animation, as if time itself was holding its breath, while we figured out how to exist in a world without his presence looming over everything like a toxic cloud. Mama moved through the house like a woman walking through the ruins of her life, touching familiar objects as if trying to convince herself they were still real, still part of a world that made sense. On the third day, she finally broke the silence that had settled over us like dust. "How long?" she asked as we sat at the kitchen table picking at breakfast. Neither of us really wanted to eat. "Since the night Grandpa died," I said, my voice steady, despite the way my heart was racing with the relief of finally being able to speak the truth without fear of consequences. She closed her eyes, and I saw tears leak out from beneath her lids like water from a cracked dam. "I should have known. I should have seen the signs. You tried to tell me, didn't you? In your own way, you tried to tell me something was wrong." "I was scared," I admitted. "Scared you wouldn't believe me. Scared of what would happen to our family if I spoke up. Scared that maybe it was somehow my fault." "Oh, baby," she whispered, reaching across the table to take my hand with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. "None of this was your fault. Not one bit of it. I'm the one who failed you. I'm the one who should have protected you, and didn't." We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own guilt and grief, and the overwhelming complexity of emotions that came with finally confronting a truth that had lived in shadows for so long. What do we do now?" I asked, and the question hung in the air between us like a bridge we both had to decide whether to cross. That's when Mama suggested we go through Grandpa's belongings, the boxes and trunks that had been sitting untouched in his room since the funeral, waiting for us to find the strength to face the memories they contained. We spent the afternoon sorting through his possessions with the careful attention of archaeologists examining artifacts from a lost civilization. His clothes smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old spice. His book's margins filled with notes in his careful handwriting. His tools worn smooth by decades of use. Each item told a story about the man who'd been the heart of our family, the anchor that had kept us from drifting completely into chaos. It was when we reached the bottom of his trunk that Mama found it his old Bible, the one he'd read from every morning and evening, the leather cover worn soft as velvet by decades of handling. As she lifted it out, something fell from between its pages and fluttered to the floor like a butterfly made of paper. An envelope yellowed with age with my name written on it in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it and began to read. "My dearest Emma, if you are reading this letter, then my worst fears have come to pass, and the darkness I sensed growing in my son has finally consumed him. I pray to God that I am wrong, that this letter will never be needed. But a grandfather's instinct tells me otherwise. I have watched Silas these past months, seen how his resentment toward me has curdled into something more dangerous. His father, my own father, was a cruel man who believed that strength came from causing pain, and despite my best efforts to break that cycle, I fear I only succeeded in driving the poison deeper underground. Your father drinks to numb the pain of his childhood, but alcohol only makes the darkness stronger. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. I've heard the things he says about control and obedience and a father's rights. A grandfather's instinct tells me that once I'm gone, you will be in danger. This is why I have set aside money for your future $2,000 in a trust account at First National Bank that only you can access when you turn 18 or graduate from high school. Use it for your education, for your escape, for building the life you deserve far from the shadows that have haunted our family for too long. But more than money, I want to give you something more valuable, the knowledge that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of love that doesn't hurt. If the worst happens, document everything. Trust your instincts. Find adults who will listen. The truth always finds a way to surface if you're persistent enough to keep digging. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's taking action in spite of fear. You have that courage, Emma. I've seen it in you since you were a little girl. Use it to protect yourself and to help others who might face similar darkness. The miracle you need won't come from heaven. It will come from within you, from the strength you find when you refuse to let evil win. Your grandfather always, Elijah. By the time I finished reading, both Mama and I were crying not the bitter tears of grief and shame we'd shed so often in recent months, but tears of gratitude and wonder at this final gift from beyond the grave. He knew, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He knew what might happen, and he tried to protect me even after he was gone. He loved you so much, Mama said, her voice thick with emotion. And he would be so proud of how brave you've been, how strong you've become despite everything that's happened. That night, I called the number Mrs. Harlan had given me. The social worker who came to our house the next day was a woman named Ms. Rodriguez, stern, but kind, with the no-nonsense manner of someone who'd seen too much suffering, but refused to become cynical about the possibility of justice. She listened to my story with professional calm, taking notes and asking gentle but probing questions that helped me articulate experiences I'd never been able to put into words before. What you've described constitutes severe sexual abuse, she said when I finished, her voice matter-of-fact, but not unkind. We'll need to involve law enforcement, conduct a medical examination, and begin the process of building a case against your father. It won't be easy, these kinds of situations never are, but you've been very smart to keep detailed records. That will help enormously. The next few weeks passed in a blur of interviews, examinations, and legal procedures that felt simultaneously overwhelming and empowering. My hidden journal became crucial evidence, those meticulous records I'd kept, proving that my accusations weren't the fantasies of a troubled teenager, but the documented experiences of a systematic pattern of abuse. But perhaps the most difficult part was dealing with the community's reaction when word inevitably leaked out about the charges against Dustville's respected deacon. The town split into factions, those who rallied around us with casseroles and support, and those who whispered that I must have been asking for it somehow, or that we should have kept our family problems private. My father hired a lawyer from the county seat, a slick man named Patterson, who specialized in defending prominent citizens accused of embarrassing crimes. His strategy was predictable, but effective in a small town where reputation mattered more than truth. Paint me as a troubled girl seeking attention. Question my mental stability, suggest that I'd misinterpreted normal father-daughter affection due to my grief over losing my grandfather. The worst part was how some people in town began to look at me, not with sympathy, but with the particular kind of suspicious curiosity reserved for girls who'd been involved in sexual situations, regardless of whether they'd had any choice in the matter. As if surviving rape made me somehow contaminated, damaged goods that decent people should keep at arm's length. Mrs. Harlan became our fierce advocate during this period, using her position as the town's most respected teacher to counter the whisper campaign against us. She organized support from other families, helped connect us with resources we didn't know existed, and most importantly, never once made me feel like I should be ashamed of speaking the truth. "You did the right thing," she told me one afternoon when the pressure from the community seemed almost unbearable. "It takes incredible courage to stand up to this kind of evil, especially when it wears a familiar face. Don't let anyone make you doubt that courage." The case went to trial 8 months later in the county courthouse that loomed over the small city like a temple to justice that felt more intimidating than inspiring. Walking into that courtroom for the first time was like entering a gladiatorial arena where truth would battle lies and my future would be decided by 12 strangers who knew nothing about me except what they heard during testimony. Taking the stand was the most terrifying experience of my life, but also the most empowering. For the first time since that night in Grandpa's bed, I was able to tell my story completely without interruption, without fear of immediate retaliation. The prosecutor, a woman named Ms. Chen who specialized in sex crimes, guided me through my testimony with patience and skill. "Can you tell the jury what happened on the night of October 15th, 1987? She asked. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice growing stronger with each word, as I recounted that first assault in detail that left no room for misinterpretation or denial. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her machine and the occasional sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat. "He said it was love," I concluded, looking directly at the jury instead of at my father, who sat at the defendant's table staring down at his hands. "But it wasn't love. Love doesn't hurt. Love doesn't threaten. Love doesn't use fear and shame to keep people quiet. What he did to me was rape, pure and simple." The cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Ms. Chen had warned me it would be. Patterson attacked every aspect of my testimony, suggesting I was confused, vindictive, or simply seeking attention. He pointed to my good grades and apparent normalcy as evidence that I couldn't have been as traumatized as I claimed. He questioned why I hadn't reported the abuse immediately, why I'd continued to live in the same house, why I'd never run away if things were really as bad as I said they were. But I was ready for his questions, prepared by months of therapy and legal preparation to defend not just my testimony, but my right to be believed. "You ask why I didn't report it immediately," I said, looking him directly in the eyes with a steadiness that surprised even me. "I was 14 years old when it started. I was isolated on a farm 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. I had no car, no money, no way to support myself. My father was a respected member of the community who used his position to convince me that no one would believe a troubled girl over a man of God. Fear isn't rational, Mr. Patterson. When you're a child being abused by the person who's supposed to protect you, survival becomes more important than justice." The second most difficult moment came when Mama took the stand, her voice shaking, but determined as she testified about what she'd witnessed the night I finally fought back, and what she'd failed to see in the months and years before that confrontation. "I failed my daughter," she said, tears streaming down her face as she faced the jury. "I was so afraid of losing my marriage, my security, my place in this community, that I chose willful blindness over protection. I saw the signs, her weight loss, her withdrawal, the way she flinched when he touched her, but I told myself it was grief over her grandfather's death. I told myself anything except the truth, because the truth was too terrible to face." Her honesty was devastating, but also powerful, showing the jury that this wasn't a case of a vindictive woman coaching her daughter to lie, but of a family finally finding the courage to confront a truth that had been destroying them from within. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when my father took the stand in his own defense. Under Ms. Chen's cross-examination, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble like a house built on sand. "Tell us about your relationship with your father, Mr. Harlan," she said, her voice deceptively gentle. "I don't see how that's relevant," he replied, but I could see sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the courthouse's air conditioning. "Humor me. What was Elijah Harlan like as a father?" For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw the angry, hurt child he'd never stopped being underneath all the layers of religious authority and masculine control. He was hard. My father said, his voice barely above a whisper. Believed in discipline. Believed that children needed to be broken before they could be properly molded. He used to beat me with a belt when I was Emma's age, sometimes for hours, until I begged him to stop. Said it was for my own good that he was teaching me to be strong. And how did that make you feel? Angry. He admitted the word coming out like it had been torn from his throat. Powerless. Like nothing I did would ever be good enough for him. Like I was weak and worthless and deserved whatever punishment he decided to give me. So when you had a daughter of your own, you decided to exert the same kind of control over her. It wasn't the same. He exploded, his composure finally shattering completely. I never hit her the way he hit me. I tried to show her love, tried to teach her what she needed to know about being a woman. Everything I did was out of love. Love? Ms. Chen's voice cut through his protests like a blade. You call raping your own daughter love? The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, every person in the courtroom could see exactly what he was: not a pillar of the community or a man of God, but a broken human being who'd chosen to perpetuate the cycle of abuse rather than break it, who'd used his daughter's body to heal wounds his own father had inflicted decades earlier. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. As the judge read the sentence, 25 years in state prison, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or relief, but a profound sadness for the little girl I'd been, who'd loved her daddy and trusted him to keep her safe. She deserved so much better than what she got, but I also felt something else, something I hadn't experienced in over a year: hope. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I believed that good could triumph over evil, that truth could overcome lies, that courage could defeat fear. The years that followed were a gradual process of healing that proved just as challenging as the legal battle had been. Dr. Sarah Williams, the therapist Ms. Rodriguez had recommended, helped me understand that recovery from trauma isn't a destination you reach, but a journey you undertake with setbacks and breakthroughs and long stretches where progress feels impossible. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened to you, she told me during one of our weekly sessions. It's about integrating those experiences into a life that has meaning and purpose. It's about refusing to let the person who hurt you define who you become. College became my focus and my salvation. Using Grandpa's trust fund and a partial scholarship I earned through academic achievement, I enrolled at the University of Texas to study psychology. Austin felt like a different world, big enough to disappear and diverse enough that my story wouldn't define me, progressive enough that seeking therapy and talking about mental health weren't seen as signs of weakness. It was in a campus support group for sexual assault survivors that I met Miguel Martinez, a graduate student in social work, who understood the landscape of trauma without requiring detailed explanations. Our relationship developed, slowly built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passion and neediness. I don't need to know all the details of what happened to you, he told me early in our relationship. What I need to know is who you are now and who you're becoming. The past informs that, but it doesn't control it. We married after I finished my bachelor's degree in a small ceremony attended by Mama Mrs. Harlan Ms. Rodriguez and a few close friends we'd made in Austin. It was the beginning of a life I'd never dared to imagine during those dark months on the farm. A life built on love that didn't hurt, trust that wasn't betrayed, and mutual support that made both of us stronger. Our first child, Sarah, was born 3 years later, followed by Elijah, named for Grandpa, 2 years after that. Becoming a mother was both the most joyful and most terrifying experience of my life, as I worried constantly about protecting them from the kind of harm I'd suffered, while not allowing my fears to limit their freedom and growth. Miguel was an extraordinary father, gentle, patient, playful in ways my own father had never been. Watching him with our children helped heal parts of my heart I'd thought were permanently damaged, showing me what healthy parental love looked like, and proving that the cycle of abuse didn't have to continue. My career took shape gradually but purposefully. After earning my master's degree in clinical psychology, I specialized in treating child survivors of sexual abuse using a combination of traditional therapy techniques and innovative approaches that addressed both the psychological and physical impacts of trauma. The work was challenging, listening to story after story of violated innocence, helping young clients find their voices and their strength, but deeply meaningful. Every child I helped represented a small victory against the forces of darkness that had once threatened to consume me. "How do you do it?" colleagues would ask. "How do you listen to such terrible stories day after day without becoming overwhelmed by the darkness?" The answer was always the same. Because I know healing is possible. Because I've lived through it myself and come out the other side. Because every child who learns to speak their truth and reclaim their power makes the world a little safer for all children. I published research on childhood trauma, spoke at conferences around the country, trained other therapists in trauma-informed care. But perhaps most importantly, I created a safe space where survivors could tell their stories without judgment and begin the long, difficult journey back to wholeness. Word of my father's death reached me 8 years after his conviction. Liver disease, the prison officials said his drinking had finally caught up with him. I felt nothing at first, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that a chapter of my life was finally closed. He'd tried to contact me several times over the years through letters I returned unopened and requests for visits I declined. Whatever he wanted to say to me, whether apologies, justifications, or final attempts at manipulation, I didn't need to hear it. My healing had happened without his participation, and I was content to leave it that way. Mama lived to see both of her grandchildren born, though her heart condition finally claimed her 5 years ago. In her final years, she'd found a peace I hadn't expected, getting her GED at 55, remarrying a gentleman who worked at the hardware store, and becoming an advocate for domestic violence survivors in their small community. "I wish I'd been braver sooner," she told me near the end, when morphine made her philosophical. "I wish I'd protected you better. But I'm proud of who you've become despite my failures. You took the worst thing that could happen to a child and turned it into a way to help other children. That's the real miracle." Mrs. Harlan lived to 93, teaching until she was 80, and inspiring generations of children to believe in their own potential. She kept in touch with me throughout my college years and beyond, always ready with encouragement when I doubted myself or struggled with the challenges of my chosen profession. Her funeral 2 years ago was standing room only testament to the lives she'd touched, simply by caring enough to see when a child was in trouble and brave enough to act on that knowledge. Today, as I sit in my office in Austin writing the final pages of this memoir, I'm 52 years old, Dr. Emma Louise Harlan Martinez, with a successful practice, a loving family, and 25 years of experience helping survivors reclaim their lives from the wreckage of trauma. Last month, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a manila envelope containing my old school essay, the one about the girl trapped in a castle with a dragon, along with a note from Mrs. Harlan's niece, who was cleaning out her aunt's house after the funeral. "Dear Dr. Martinez, I found this in my aunt's desk, along with a note saying it should be sent to you after her death. She kept it all these years and told me she used it, with the names changed, to train other teachers about recognizing signs of abuse in their students. She wanted you to know that your courage to speak truth, even in metaphor, has helped protect dozens of other children over the years. She also wanted me to tell you that she always knew you were destined for greatness, even during your darkest moments. Your survival and success have been a source of inspiration to her for 30 years. With admiration, Margaret Harlan Stevens." I held that essay in my hands, pages I'd written as a desperate 15-year-old who didn't know if anyone would ever truly understand what she was trying to say, and wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude, for the ripple effects of courage, for the way one person's decision to speak truth can echo through decades and touch lives in ways they never imagined. The 16-year-old client I saw this afternoon reminded me why this work matters so much. She sat in the same chair where hundreds of survivors have sat over the years, telling me about her stepfather's special games and how she wasn't sure anyone would believe her if she spoke up. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. I told her using the same words I say to every young client struggling with misplaced guilt and shame. When they fail in that responsibility, it's never the child's fault. Never. She looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young, and I saw myself reflected there, the girl I'd been, the woman I'd become, the bridge between trauma and healing that my life had constructed. How do you know it gets better? She asked the same question I've been asked hundreds of times by hundreds of different survivors. I smiled, thinking of my children's laughter echoing through our house. Miguel's gentle hands, holding mine, the countless survivors I've watched reclaim their power and rebuild their lives from ashes. Because I survived, I told her. Because I fought back when fighting seemed impossible. Because I found my voice when silence felt safer. Because I refused to let the person who hurt me define who I would become. And if I can do all that, so can you. It's not magic. Healing is messy, non-linear, sometimes brutally difficult work that requires more courage than most people will ever have to summon. But it's possible. It's always possible. And sometimes that possibility is enough to light the way forward, even in the darkest moments. As I finish writing this memoir, I think about the miracle Grandpa wrote about in his letter, the miracle that wouldn't come from heaven, but from within me, from the strength I'd find when I refused to let evil win. He was right, of course. The miracle wasn't divine intervention or supernatural rescue. It was something far more powerful and far more achievable, the miracle of human resilience, of inner strength, that grows stronger under pressure, of the ability to transform our deepest wounds into sources of healing for others. My name is Emma Louise Harlan Martinez. I am a survivor, a healer, a mother, a wife, a voice for those who haven't found their voices yet. I am living proof that no one is too broken to heal, that no pain is too great to overcome, that no childhood is too damaged to build a meaningful life upon. The silence that once protected my abuser has been shattered forever. In its place is a voice that speaks truth, offers hope, and refuses to be silenced again. A voice that says to every survivor still trapped in darkness, you are not alone, you are not powerless, and you are worthy of love that doesn't hurt. That is the miracle. That is the victory. That is the gift I can offer to a world that still contains too many children who need someone to show them that escape is possible, that healing is real, and that courage can indeed triumph over fear. And that, dear readers, is the most powerful truth of all.